strategies for the recovery. We had a fantastic start of the day where we looked at the impact of COVID on cultural participation, and we had the perspectives, of course, from the European Commission, our partner in this webinar series, but also we had a bit of a deep dive on what's happening with museums and their audiences, and also with the music sector and all of us who are listening to music. And one of the key messages was to understand what is the process of creation of music, and also maybe other, if I may say, cultural goods and services, and the protection of authors' rights, and etc. But now we have an exciting session ahead of us, 2 hours. And the objective is to understand how exactly we can measure cultural participation. Well, once again, the definition, a very primitive definition of cultural participation is all activities that we do to, well, it can be passive or active. Passive when we go to theaters or to museums and we consume something that is produced by the others, or active when we sing in a choir or read books. So this is a very simplistic definition of cultural participation. And we really want to be able to better measure it and to provide better evidence to our policymakers in cities, regions, and also, of course, in national governments, so that they design better policies, because we all believe that cultural participation can impact tremendously on local development and fight exclusion, and also increase well-being, mental health, and has incredible links with education and improving educational employability skills and so on. So now, this particular session is structured in 3 very interesting blocks. First of all, we would like to hear from our colleagues in Eurostat and in ISTAT on the statistical tools and the statistical approaches to measuring cultural participation. And we'll also touch upon the main findings there. What are the barriers that you see from your different surveys, barriers that existed before the lockdown, before the current crisis, but also barriers maybe that are increasing, exacerbated by the current crisis. So that's a bit of a deep dive on really hardcore statistical measurement approaches to cultural participation, with some conclusions at the end and recommendations on how cities and regions can better define their measurement frameworks. And then we'll move on to what about big data? Can we use big data to complement gaps in statistical approaches and provide a better picture, more up-to-date picture of cultural participation trends and opportunities? And then, of course, we would like also to hear a perspective from the foundations. Why foundations? Because they were very active in funding arts and culture historically, and also very much implementing cultural participation and more broadly cultural projects themselves. And of course, as funders and as implementers, they're very much interested to measure the outcomes of their work. So once again, that's maybe another angle, another perspective on how to measure cultural participation. So with this very brief introduction, I would like to repeat that our dear audience can ask questions through the Q&A function, and I hope we'll have a little bit of time here and there to pick up some of your questions. And I'm very pleased to introduce our panel today. We have with us Marta Beck, who is responsible for culture and sports statistics in Eurostat, Annalisa Cicerchia, who is her colleague in Italy, so also from a statistical body, national statistical body, and we also have with us Victoria Teca Amstoy, who is the associate professor in the Department of Economic Analysis at the University of Basque Country. We have with us Robert Manchon, president of Culture Action Europe, Harry Verwaayen, sorry if I mispronounced your name, Harry, who is executive director of Europeana, and Luisella Carnelli, who is a senior researcher and consultant at the Fondazione Fitzgeraldo, and Matteo Bagnasco, culture goal manager, Compagnia di San Paolo Foundation in Italy. So let us maybe start first with the discussion on the official statistical measurement frameworks. And I wanted to invite Marta and Annalisa To start, maybe if you can briefly say a few words, what is your definition? What is the traditional formal definition of cultural participation? And well, maybe how has it evolved over time? And what are the ways of measurement of cultural participation, like surveys, administrative data, etc.? Maybe we can start with the EU level, with Eurostat, and then Annalisa, we will hear a bit more on what's happening in Italy.
Good morning, everybody from Luxembourg, from home, unfortunately, because I would like to be at office. So just to tell you very briefly, because, we are doing many things for culture statistics. We are really trying to extract all data related to culture in existing European surveys, because we have no data source really at European level at culture. As you know, culture is under competency of countries, of the member states. So we are really extracting all existing information on existing data sources. We try to cover them in the best way as well for the future, to cover culture, to add questions related to culture in our surveys, etc. So just, of course, cultural participation is the most important dimension of the framework on culture statistics. We have domain.
Marta, I think you need to unmute. It was just a couple of seconds. You need to, yeah, thanks.
Okay, but did you hear what I said before? No.
Yeah, you just stopped for a couple of seconds, so I think we're fine.
Yeah, okay. So cultural participation is the most important dimension of our European framework of culture statistics. So it is the raison d'etre of cultural sector, of course. So very briefly, we can say that we have cultural participation traditional, was in the past, and it continue and will continue, of course, I hope. So all this passive participation, going to the cinema, to the live performances, reading books, etc., and active participation. So the practice of cultural activities, you know, singing, dancing, etc. And I think here is the important new thing that with the democratization a little of culture and with all these technological changes, more people could be creators now, you know, so they can put online their works, their songs, their videos. So this is something new, which could be now captured by our ICT surveys. So we have surveys on cultural participation. It is in Europe, it's European statistics on income and living conditions every year, and we have ad hoc modules on different subjects. So we have the question about cultural participation, but from the traditional way. So reading books, going to cinema, to the live performances, etc. The last time we had these questions, 2015, and the next one will be 2022. There is a big, now it will be every 6 years. It was decided like this, but in many countries, the surveys on cultural participation as well, relatively, it is not every year normally, but every even 5 years or even 10 years. So it is a big survey, more detailed as we have, of course, in the Silk, but okay, it is a relatively heavy survey to be done, it's costly, etc. So we have this survey on cultural participation every 6 years now. 22 will be the next one. It will be improvement of the question as well. We have really tried to do better. And okay, we have now every year a good survey on ICT participation, on use of the ICT for different purposes by household and individuals. So every year, and the data are very fresh, they published how to say, 3 months after the year of reference. So they're very fresh about ICT use. So we have some question about use of ICT for cultural purposes, about the reading newspapers, about watching TV, watching the films, listening to the music, Playing games online, etc. So now we have two different surveys on cultural participation. There are the surveys for the individuals. The individuals are asked for different things. And of course, they are another block of data. There are the administrative data from organizations, from museums, from all cultural institutions, but we are not collecting them. Eurostat has not, the mandate to do this. We are collaborating now with EGMUS. There is the European Network of Museum Statisticians. So we are working together because they publish the data museums on their site. Every year there are the data, but we are working now about the harmonization of this data, because you can imagine that some concepts are not the same in the countries, so sometimes it is difficult, but we try to improve this. So what I can say as well, we have as the survey, the time use survey, that is only every 10 years, unfortunately, but this is a very interesting survey at national level. It is published more, more quickly than in our level, European. But okay, there are very interesting data, because there are data about the time used for different activities, about the main activities and the secondary activities. So you are cooking and you are listening to music. So the both things are captured. And even we will have the question about the satisfaction from this activity. So it will be the new approach, very interesting. We have as well, there's some small data, but very, very small, about cities. So there is the satisfaction about cultural facilities in the cities. So the most recent data are from 2019, so relatively fresh. And okay, it is many things to be said, but I would like to invite you to visit our website. I have put the link on our discussion on our discussion table, so we can see really many data with metadata. There are articles, there are publications. So please have a look if you are interested, because there are many very interesting things. But just to tell you, of course, the majority of them there are for national level only. There is a big issue what to do at regional and local level. What we have two things in several surveys. So we have the regions, so by NUTS classification. So we have NUTS 1, NUTS 2, but the problem is the reliability of data at this level. So in SILC, in this living condition survey, it will improve every year. So we will see how to, depends for which country as well. For bigger is easier, but for others, about the reliability of data at the regional level. And another aspect is we have for all surveys on household, we have information. There are core variables: age, sex, educational attainment, etc., and degree of urbanization. So we have for all this data distinction of rural, urban, and intermediate areas. So we have this data, at least this. It is already something. So I think I will now give the floor to Annalisa, because I think it's more important to see the data at national level and after regional, I think for the purpose of our seminar as well. So
thank you so much, Marta. And well, there is already quite a comprehensive set of data, and also with some historical trends, as you just explained. But I also remember you were often saying in different sorts of public meetings with the cultural sector, when the representatives of different cultural sectors were saying, well, we need better data on this, so etc. But in fact, the process is, well, you said already that, well, the availability of data improves over time and will continue to improve, but also it's a bit of a task for the cultural sectors themselves, and maybe well, different government stakeholders to say that we need this data, in fact, and also to give an incentive to the national statistical bodies to start collecting more data. So it's also a sort of there are two parties to this relationship. So it's not only Eurostat that can be improving its own data provision while sourcing the data from the countries, but there should be demand for this data, and this will enormously help to gather and provide new data if the objective is, if this purpose is more clear. Well, so that was my reaction to what you were saying, Martin. Yes, analysis. So maybe we had from the European perspective, what about Italy? And I know that you can also share with us, and you've been conducting a number of surveys to see what's happening now. Well, not now, today, but during the first lockdown period. And we are very eager to hear from that. Annalisa, please.
Thank you, Katja, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity. And yes, I would like to start from exactly from that, from the point about the demand, the statistical demand, because I think, and I'm sure Matt agrees with me on that, that we had different political motives behind the demand for data about cultural participation. Of course, there was many years ago, I'm speaking of the 1980s, for instance, a strong idea that covering this area meant learning something about how people spent their leisure time. There was a very strong leisure time oriented approach, but it was in a world where the time, the working time and the leisure time were clearly separated. And I think that there was a second wave where, and probably the instruments we have today are still reflecting that view, that there was an interest, a legitimate interest in the economics of the sector. So this is the reason why we are able to gather so many information about consumption habits. And we do have, of course, expenditure, public expenditure and household expenditure, although it is not totally pure, it's mixed with other kind of expenses, but that is reflects, I mean, a political question about cultural participation that it's different from now. And I was so happy today in the previous, when the previous speakers have spoken, to see that the instance and the topic of the relationship within well-being and cultural participation is arrived at the perception of the right levels, decisional levels, so to say, as the other aspects like the social impacts, social cohesion, and so on and so forth, the urban regeneration, and so on and so forth. So I expect that in due time, we will be invited to produce statistics also serving that perspective. And just to start with Italy, I would like to say that while we of course endorse the same, we share the same definition of cultural participation that Marta and yourself, Kadia, have described, that is based more or less on active and passive outdoor and indoor consumption and much less on practice. However, it is a very similar and shared concept. In Italy, we are using a synthetic index of cultural participation that is built on a minimum number of frequency of attending cultural events or reading books, magazines and newspapers in our system of measure of well-being, our PES, misure del benessere equo e sostenibile. And I like to underline that Italy is one of the few instances so far where the definition of well-being has cultural heritage and landscape as basic domains, plus a synthetic index of cultural participation as one of the main indicators. I won't repeat the surveys that Marta has already mentioned, because of course, since we are participating in all the harmonized and regulated surveys that are common to all countries, collaborating with Eurostat, I won't go back to them. I will try to pinpoint some peculiar activities that we have every year since 1993. We have a huge survey with a very large sample. It addresses households, and this is interesting because it allows us, together with a lot of other information, believe me, it's a nightmare to be selected as a respondent in that investigation, but however, is a real treasure for us, together with a lot of other information that is about daily habits, health, consumption, food, physical activity, and economic conditions, many things. Within that survey, we have a very elementary investigation of visit cultural places, museums, archaeological areas, going to concerts, theater, cinema. And the important aspect that I would like to underline is that we have the household context, so we can relate individual behaviors to their family, that we start, where possible, of course, considering individuals aged 3 and up. So we have also a nice overview of children in this regard. And yes, we have all the other informations that Marta has already indicated about the geographic location, the level of educational attainment, and so on. I'll skip the module on ICT because it's very, well, there was another sample survey that is Citizens and Leisure Time, that is our, let's say, in-depth investigation. It is still occasional because it is every 5 to 7 years, and it is more detailed on cultural habits and also cultural practices. So if people sings, paints, acts, not only goes to, not only consumes culture. In the other survey, in the other slide, if it's possible, I would like to go to the next one, because I wanted only to mention to you that we have 3 official and semi-official surveys during the phase 1, we call it phase 1 of the pandemic. ISTAT carried out flash surveys of days at home during lockdown. It was a telephone survey, and where the general trend, if reading, if painting, if cooking, if baking bread was prevailing. And I would like to recall the many interesting things that Alberto Garlandini said about the risk of a widening gap, a widening social divide that is also carried by the digital divide that the same survey showed, since we have an high percentage of household without the appropriate instruments for having good connections. There is a second survey that is, it was carried out by the Ministry of Cultural Heritage and Activities. It was on museums audiences during lockdown. And this is a peculiar survey because it tended to capture the participant, I mean the affectionate people that go to cinema, to museums, sorry. And it was interesting because it was built on trying to highlight the subjective relationship and also the sentiment that connects people to the museums of their favorite museums. There were also interesting informations about the willingness to pay for supporting museums, the relationship between digital visits or activities, and real visits, and some hints for the future development of the museum cultural policies. Another foundation that it is a spin-off of the Ministry of Cultural Heritage addressed instead experts, a large panel of experts, and they tried to investigate how, in their view, museums were impacted and could possibly respond from the point of view of a special subsector of participants, which is the dedicated expert and affectionate public. So that are these two areas, the ordinary surveys and the special surveys, can add maybe to give you an idea. And there are also other things, but I think they belong more to the forthcoming topics. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Annalisa. And yeah, I think ourselves and also the audience will be very much interested to learn more from the results of this surveys, especially the surveys that were focusing on the during the lockdown period. Now I wanted to ask also Marta and you to tell us a bit more what this data tells us about the barriers. So of course we know that, well, factors like income, education, well, degree of urbanization all have an impact on how and if people participate. But maybe you can just dip a bit and provide some reflections on these barriers from the data that you have. Marta, maybe you go first.
Yeah. Okay. So there are two aspects to approach of this barriers obstacle. So the first one is just the analysis of social variables. So sex, if the sex is obstacle, if the educational attainment, age, income, type of household, degree of urbanization, etc. So it is one approach to see this. And another one in the SILC we are using now just a question about the reason of no participation. I think it's very interesting. So we have the well, lack of interest, there is the financial obstacle, there are proximity problems, and other reasons which will be more explored in the 22. There will be a lack of time or, for example, alternative on online content. So I think that the results are very interesting because there is the differences between countries about this analysis are really very interesting. So some variables are determined more in one country than in other. So there are, for example, and about these reasons of no participation, I think it is really something for the policymakers to be analyzed. The most reported reason is lack of interest. It's not finance, no. It's 40% is lack of interest for all these cultural, participation events, even in cinema or in theater, live performance in museums, etc. Lack of interest. And after is maybe even not 20, there are the financial reasons and 10 proximity problems in some countries more than in others, of course. So you see, I think the analysis of this data should be interesting for the policymakers.
Sorry for interrupting, but I think we really need to address this point, lack of interest. And so what's behind it? Is it that cultural venues are too intimidating? Is it this problem with high brow, low brow culture and people just don't feel being included in this or being represented by this kind of cultural activities? So I think these are the questions that we need to address really later, and I will torture our following speakers on this, but that's a very valid point.
Yeah, okay. But of course, you see, we have the data. We try to do them the best, more comparable and good. And we really provide some very simple analysis. We have all this analyzed in the articles, in the publication. And it is the first, I think this for researchers is the place to even go more, to try to explain, to cross different variables and to see which is the are determinants of this, for example, lack of interest. So, but just another question, because we have no time. I think that we are speaking for all European surveys, we have people aged 16 and more, or 15 or more, depends. So I think the children are very missing in our data, children, adolescents. So and there are some countries, as the good practices, they are doing really the surveys on participation, social cultural participation of children. It's another aspect I would like just to mention, because I think we are missing something. You know about this lack of interest of young people, which is the reason of this. It is not my my role to reply to this, but okay, that's the question. So I think this type of data are interesting to be analyzed anyway. So.
Well, thank you so much, Marta. Now we have maybe 10 more minutes to spend on this, and it will be great to hear from Annalisa. What's your take? Can you add something more on this? What are the barriers? What would data tell us about the barriers to cultural participation from an Italian perspective, please? And then we can also have a bit of a exchange on what, in fact, how to help cities and regions to build better measurement frameworks. And I know that you had some advice on this, Annalisa.
Okay, thank you. So about the barriers of, let's speak in a pre-COVID situation. In a pre-COVID situation, of course, we have barriers that are physical, that are related to, for some areas in particular, and I'm speaking of Italy, where a large percentage of the country is inland areas, so with little access to facilities. There is a physical barrier that is not only something that concerns people with physical limitation or cognitive limitations, and in that case depends on the ability of the cultural organizations to meet them and to become more accessible. But I'm speaking of isolated settlements where it is very difficult physically to reach. I mean, where you won't find a place to buy books, or you don't have a cinema, or you don't have good connection, and so on. I'm speaking of a pre-COVID situation so far. We have also tried at ISTAT to work a little more in the direction of cognitive barriers. That is what Marta refers as reported as lack of interest. And if you are highly interested, your willingness to pay is increased, of course. We are here instead, and especially in Italy, in a situation where basically it is the family that orients strongly the taste and interest of people. So cultural practice reflects inequalities and is also strongly related to the educational attainment and income of parents in the family. The example, so we have associated for a very long time that young people who read generally parents who in turn are book readers. And while we have a strong, a nice level of attending theater, concert, or visiting cultural heritage in the age where school helps them to go there, we have a total drop. During the total, we have a significant drop in some areas. So we tried 3 years ago to relate, to try to reconstruct the cultural diet, the cultural profiles of different social groups. I think we don't have time here to give even a sketchy account of the experiment, but the presentation is available, and we saw that there are some recurring patterns, and there are some forms of cultural consumptions that are more frequent in some groups. We have very broadly speaking an elite that is making composed by high attainment level people with good income and is still active, or we have silver pensions, so-called people who are retired but enjoys a high lifestyle. Then we have a lot of intermediate social groups that are families living in provincial areas, or we have households with we have called them young blue collars, or we have the retired people from the working class, and each of them presents different forms of social and cultural consumption, and probably specific barriers. So we have worked a little on that basis. So, and we have tried also to devise some specific, so to say, tailored policies to overcome those specific barriers, working on the existing tastes, existing consumption or levels of participation or even expenditure. I'm very synthetic, so I hope this is understandable, however, and I've proposed tables and figures, but I think we have no time to go there. So basically, we have physical barriers that must be removed, cognitive barriers, which are much harder and difficult to be removed. I'm stopping here unless you want that I give you something.
We'll absolutely share the presentations as well, and any other materials with people. So there is a lot of demand for this, obviously. And we have maybe 4 minutes now to conclude this round of discussion. And Annalisa, still I turn to you, because we want to learn from your experience, and you had this example in Tuscany you wanted to refer to, on how regions can really better measure cultural participation. You can say maybe a few words on 2-3 minutes.
Okay. I'll try to be very synthetic. I think the interesting aspect, Tuscany is a region with a strong tradition of cultural statistics, and they are very well equipped and full of initiatives in that respect. And they have carried out in 2018 a survey that I think is particularly interesting, because it is aimed at grasping subjective perception of cultural heritage. So mostly, apart from the regular data that we know, that we try to collect at the EU level, at the national level, and in general, they try to investigate the specific individual relationship with cultural heritage. So how citizens perceive their relationship with food and wine, landscape and towns of art. And let me underline that Tuscany used to be, until the breakdown, of course, of the pandemic, a tourist region, but they insisted on residents. So it's not the tourist, it's the resident, is the citizens living there. So they try to investigate the perceived benefits of cultural richness in terms of job opportunities and quality of life. They tried also to describe consumption level and determinants that are consonant with the discoveries that we have carried out at the national level. And also they try to investigate obstacles to cultural participation and requests for improvements. And here costs, opening hours, and transportation were the most frequent suggestions. And they also investigated the future outlook of the personal culture consumption style of the Tuscany residents. So I think we have a lot of interesting hints and suggestions there.
Well, thank you so much, Annalisa, and I think we need a day or two to really explore this further and in detail. If I can ask you and Marta to maybe have a look at the Q&A, because there were a couple of questions. One on culture, gender statistics from Italy, from Erminia, whom we all know very well. And also there were requests to share maybe some of the questionnaires that I used in Italy, maybe to help also other places to shape the measurement frameworks. And so please have a look at the Q&A, and maybe you can have a minute to answer these questions. And of course, I'm very curious to hear at the very end of this long session some reflections from Nadim Ahmad, who is our new Deputy Director in the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Cities and Regions, but who in his previous incarnations shaped a lot of OECD agenda on the data of statistics, and also had a lot of experience on this domain in the UK. So it will be very interesting to hear from you, Nadim, at the end of the session. What are your takeaways from these discussions? But now, thank you so much, Marta. Thank you so much, Annalisa. Incredibly rich discussion. And now let's turn to the next issue. Once again, with this session, we're trying to see how we can provide better evidence, better data for policymaking, and especially at regional and local level. So the question is, what about big data? How, why, what if we use it to complement the official statistics? And of course, we know that with big data, it's much more timely. We can see what's happening today or just yesterday, whereas with official statistics, there is this time lag. But there are also some cons against using big data. So let's have a bit of a deep dive here. And I wanted to turn first to Robert and Victoria, maybe. So can you maybe provide some very introductory remarks on can big data help closing these data gaps, and also understand as the barriers to cultural participation that were already mentioned, and what are the advantages and the disadvantages of using big data? So Robert Manchon, if you could please start this session. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Maybe later I will talk a little bit more concrete on the specific case, what we have been doing in Rome. But in very general, the problem with cultural participation measurement, as we have seen before, that while we have relatively existing data sources, when we want to compare across countries at the Euro level, or in some countries, you can go even further to region level. Data on participation is very patchy when it comes to comparisons. So it means surveys are the primary methodology, but surveys are very, very expensive. So if you want to do a quality survey, it costs much more than most cities can afford. The question is, how can we combine the reliability and the statistical robustness of a well-designed sample survey and observational data, which I call most of the big data is based on direct observations. Here, the big question is accessibility of the big data. It had been, especially in the past, a privilege of a very few large companies. Think of Google, Facebook, others who know everything about our own cultural participation patterns. So they can very finely fine-tune and manipulate our behavior based on our past behavior. So they the big question: can this similar technology be used at a much lower level for public use and not for private profit? And how can we do that? So big data is has its own advantages, disadvantages. I would say that some common misunderstanding with big data is that since you have so many observations, that means you have much more reliable data as well. But it's not quite the case. You really have to know how biased can be big data and how it can be validated with using other sources. So what we are doing is trying to combine local level survey data and see whether we can continue without the expensive survey data on certain aspects to use data which is coming from data providers. In our case, we have done that in 2018. It was one of the, it was Vodafone, which owned 40% of the Italian market in terms of mobile phone penetration. So they had a special arrangement in the Italian legislation at that time. I don't know if it's still true or not, that they could, while they are anonymizing the data, so you don't really know, is disconnected from the person in principle, but you can follow the person's over 18 months time period. That means that every single day, on the average, 2,000 times, your phone location is being recorded. So that means 40% of the Italian population for 18 months times 30 or 31 days times 2,000. I cannot even calculate how many data points you have. But being able to have that type of data, it means that what Marta was talking about, the sparsity and the valuability of, at the same time, of the time budget data, you have the perfect time budget data. Because even the best time budget survey, which can help you to deduce on cultural participation, is based on a 15 minutes time period, a memory recall of what you remember you have done on that particular 15 minutes. And I'm sorry to say that I am getting very old and I have no clue what I did a week ago in a particular, or even if it's a daily time budget, diary method, it has a memory problem. Here you have a direct observation. So what you can do with it is, of course, create patterns, understand everyday life patterns, how they are related. Plus, as you know, both OpenStreetMap, also Google Map, have points of interest. So we have, for example, there are wonderful applications, for example, for Rome, of what are the cultural locations. But even in Google, you can see if somebody was at a particular X and Y coordinate point at a particular time in the evening at 8 o'clock and have stayed there till 10 o'clock, and that had been, for example, a theater, then you can have a measurement, a direct measurement of where they were without probability. What you don't have is, of course, the evaluation part. So you raised the questions before, why and why not, and so forth. For that one, either you speculate from patterns, or you are going back to the direct source of asking direct questions in survey. And in my mind, it's really the combination of the two, which is giving you an observatory possibility for reasons for and patterns of non-participation. And just one more thing here. You don't have to rely on the mercy of large phone companies, and because in the last 12 months, there's a plethora of data providers, and we are working with a number of them who are selling you anonymized data. Every time when you are checking your mobile phone of what the weather is like, that means you gave a permission to somebody to track you. And that somebody is selling your data to another data aggregator. So that means we can put together, we have done that for a number of cities where you can build an observatory based on this kind of secondary big data and work from there. But I can come back maybe later on showing a couple of things of how we combined the observations, because it's really not participation as such, but participation for what and why, and what the consequences, and what the well-being consequences, what the mental health consequences of participating.
Well, thank you so much, Robert. And indeed, it will be extremely interesting to see how you worked with Rome, combining these different data sources and approaches, and so how you did it so that other places can learn, but also what are the lessons and the conclusions from this research. Victoria, now I turn to you. So what's your take on this? Can big data help us, and what are the other ways to fill the data gaps when we try to measure cultural participation?
Hello, good morning from Bilbao, from Spain. We are in the university, we are open, and I'm very pleased and happy to have been invited to bring some insights from the researcher point of view about what we know, what we would like to know, and our insights, our expectations most of the time about big data. So regarding participation, typically this has been measured as activities, what is seen. Right? We know very little about its effects, how this is experienced, and which are the sentiments and feelings associated with participation. And I fully agree with what has been said in the previous session about the barriers. The main barrier for participation, this is disengagement, this is the lack of interest. And there are specific patterns of good explanatory variables for disengagement and the lack of interest. So regarding big data, probably there are good news, or there are nice expectations about overcoming the idea of participation as activity, what is seen, but creating experience and how this affects and how this is perceived and how this is experienced. And regarding barriers, probably the best hope that we can have for big data is about location of activities, and this is important from the regional and from the local point of view about creating inclusive spaces and about dealing with a controversial or conflicting relationship, for instance, local residents and visitors, tourism, and such that. So from the time being, we know very little from research derived from big data. And most of what we know about the determinants, the barriers of cultural participation being measured as activity, as time spent, as money spent, right, comes from these big representative samples of the population from official statistics. When talking about big data, there is not a clear definition. So probably we are talking about complex data sets that are combining some of the information that come from these big surveys, but also administrative registers and mostly user-generated data. Sometimes these user-generated data are somehow like the footprints of physical or digital participation itself. Think about visits to museums or walks around historic cities, digital transactions in terms of ticketing, and sometimes these data are the result of already digitally mediated participation, such as social networks or the digital access to enjoy some digital cultural content, like streaming, for instance. So there is not a homogeneous, when talking about big data, probably at the local, regional level, when trying to learn and gain insights for action, to evaluate or to design or to implement policies, we need to think about which is the big data, right? Or the agreement and the organization of very unstructured data and how they are going to be useful in order to answer some questions and not useful at all in order to answer some others. So, well, we know very little for the time being, but the good news is that what we know from the research conducted on surveys over representative samples of the population is quite valid as a reference, so that's good. So we don't have to start building from nothing, and we can already take on board some of the results. Well, this is about societies that want to, democratic societies that want to be inclusive, resilient, and reflexive, as was captured in Horizon 2020, and in the spirit of many of the policies that informed the action in Europe and in European member states. So, well, cultural participation is difficult to measure because it's becoming more hybrid, more integrated, dematerialized, right? So what we want big data for? I think that we want to get new insights that are relevant for policymaking, that is going to be targeted at better addressing disengagement, and very relevant regarding the first set of presentations this morning, to inequality. We want to increase participation, but we don't want to increase participation or the frequency or the intensity of participation by itself. We want to reduce inequality in participation. The data that come out from the analysis of SILC, this is the Survey of Income and Living Conditions, the 2015 big overview of cultural participation in the countries. So, of course, that there are different parts of inequality, and there are countries which are highly equal in terms of the frequency and the variety of cultural participation, and some others that show very, very divergent patterns. And probably the lack of interest, which in some research conducted here in Spain by researchers in University of Oviedo for well, this is the main predictor for that, or it's not a question of income, it's a question of education and exposure, right? Formal and informal education. So if we want to increase diversity of participation, we want to reduce the segregation, and we want to create places of encounter in the life dimension of cultural participation. But we want also to see how the repertoire or the creation of groups that are not mainstreamed, which are not hybrid cultural participation, and which are groups that can be at risk of poverty, exclusion, not engaged in civic life, how we can bring them, or how we can detect what they are producing, and how this can be incorporated into the supply of cultural participation. Because we have to take into account that because of its externalities and the effects of my cultural participation, my cultural consumption over my community, then, well, there will be public provision, and public policies are directly going through the supply side of it. Right, so we want to reduce segregation, and this means that what we can do, or what we want this big data for. For instance, we would like to learn more about unconventional cultural participation for different publics, and notably in public space. We could learn a lot by using this user-generated data. I'm thinking about tracking mobiles, for instance, the cultural consumption of teenagers. There are good phenomena of the appropriation of public spaces around big or small cultural infrastructures. So, for instance, here in Bilbao, the Guggenheim Museum, which was and has been a terrific economic motor for the regeneration of the city, this is a place that it is a very interesting public space, and teenagers are around producing, dancing, and creating their own thing. The same happens with Tabacalera in San Sebastián, which was the old tobacco factory, and how the teenagers and marginalized groups, and not only teenagers, migrant teenagers, move around. And also about, I'm thinking about the Museo de la Evolución Humana in Burgos, right? So we could use the potential of these unstructured data and big data in order to track what they do. And there is one initiative which I find absolutely amazing, which is the Atlas of Inequality by MIT researchers. Esteban Moro is in charge of that. And they find out that science museums in Boston is the most inclusive place by tracking the origin of the people that go there and meet there. So there is one possibility in order to see how inclusive effectively, because it's not a question of just granting access, but keeping track of how effective the access to those cultural infrastructures, to those cultural services is. So, and of course, this could also solve some technical problems of the conventional statistics. I'm thinking about, well, time use surveys are wonderful, but the problem with time use surveys is that when cultural participation is not done on the daily or nearly weekly basis, then you just get a zero, right? So how to track with that, you don't know so much. We can gain quicker response in order to reduce internal lag policies. The fact that you can nowcast can open a very interesting avenue for experimenting. So, well, summarizing, this could overcome some meaningful critiques that said that it was a question of treating a very complex and multidimensional phenomena with a very inappropriate set of metrics. One of the dangers of this thing is that probably this is making it more complex, right? So there is a problem of innumeracy in our societies, and there is a big digital divide in citizens for the audience, but also in these citizens when they are planners, local authorities, or they manage some cultural resource. I'm thinking about museums at the local level. For instance, I think that we are not doing our best of things such as Google Trends, which could be a pretty accurate description of the origin of visitors, for instance, when trying to estimate the economic impact of cultural infrastructures, and also to track digital connectivity of cities. So we could gain, as a summary, better insights for evidence-driven policies, which is absolutely needed. Then we could also, when something is scarce, big data should help to better allocate under some criteria. I'm thinking about different pricing. Well, not perfect pricing discrimination, but about allocating who is buying access to different cultural goods at which prices. I'm thinking about theaters, and also about when there's space for residents versus visitors is too scarce, how to allocate that. What we do not need, something that we don't need big data for is that it would be absolutely useless, to run the same sort of analysis and trying to run regressions over larger samples of observations. And of course, we need to involve computational social sciences, which is a very complex systems, which is by nature collaborative, which is by nature multidisciplinary, and which should also be incorporated in the governance and the participatory governance of cultural heritage and cultural infrastructures. That's all. Yeah.
That's all, as you say. Well, Victoria, it was fantastic. That really covered a lot of issues and setting the agenda for further research and very practical advice as well. And thanks also for mentioning this Atlas of Inequality. It's a good tip it's a good thing to look into. Now, maybe I may turn to Harry. Well, Europeana works with really thousands of European archives, libraries, museums, and you also help and empower the heritage sector in its digital transformation. So I guess over the past few months, you had quite an increase in demand for your work, both maybe from the audience, from us who were looking at Europeana site to access different things, but maybe also from the museums and other cultural institutions who wanted to quickly digitalize their offers. So what's your maybe take on what are the main persistent barriers to cultural participation, and maybe have they increased over the past few months or decreased? And so what's your take on this and on the issues that we're discussing now in this session? Harry, please.
Yes, thank you, Kathy, and hello, everyone. Indeed, the past couple of months were, from my perspective, as an organization that supports digital transformation, an incredibly interesting period. You rightfully said it. We've seen, this is circumstantial data, and I'm not a statistician like some of you. But for example, a very influential report from NEMO, the Network of Museums Association, showed that even very early on in June, 60% of the museums had increased their online activities and also had shown up to 100% doubling of traffic on their website. It's probably similar to what we've seen at the Europeana website as well. Nice increases of cultural participation. Now, one of the difficulties when you talk about data of cultural participation is that, of course, much of the activity doesn't happen on our own sites. Much of that will happen on big platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and so forth. And that immediately shows, one of the really big challenges that we have, I think, as a sector is that, a lot of that activity happens in environments that are privately owned and controlled by big corporate organizations. You have to question whether that's the kind of participation you necessarily want to have. And B, it means that the data that is accumulated, cultural participation data, is also captured by these organizations. Now, one of the things that Europeana has always been a strong advocate of is democratization of access to culture. So it shouldn't just be, put your cultural artifacts on a website and hope that people come to you. We sincerely believe that it's important to make that data available, especially when we talk about cultural heritage, not only cultural data, as openly as possible, so that it can go to the places where people convene and have that cultural participation. So I think that's one aspect. We did see a lot of increase in cultural participation and demand for culture in an online environment. And the other part of the questions, Kathy, was, do you see an increased demand of support that is needed from museums and libraries and so forth? And the answer to that is also unequivocally yes. Again, referencing that report from NEMO, I think 2/3 of those museums that were investigated also said that they weren't equipped to do this. They had to ask staff who had absolutely no background in digital to take on new responsibilities that they weren't trained for and so forth. Now, one of the observations we've made in our network was that there is a real danger that people start replicating what they're doing in a physical world in an online environment, right? So I think most cultural participation we've seen in social media levels. The Royal Academy of Arts in London is a great example of that. They had a very simple question: who draws us the best hand? And that may sound like a very trivial thing to do, but there was an incredible surge of people sharing their own drawings in all kinds of shapes and forms, tripled the Academy's Twitter account to 500,000. Now, we can all applaud ourselves and applaud the Royal Academy for that, but is that exactly the kind of participation we want and need? And I think that comes back to our definition of cultural participation and the underlying ambitions that I think some of you have already expressed, right? So I was looking at the UNESCO definition from the Cultural Statistics Handbook. So cultural participation here is defined as any activity representing a way of increasing your own cultural and informational capacity and capital, which helps define identity and allows for personal expression. So I think that's a pretty, to me, a pretty solid definition that I can work with. And maybe I can now dip into the question of big data a little bit. So my thesis would be, yes, the more we move to a digital form of cultural participation, the more important it will be to also collect big data. And since you guys are all more into numbers, I dug up a few numbers on big data. Apparently, we've collected so far 44 zettabytes of data around the world. I don't know if any of you know how much a zettabyte is. I looked it up and it's a one with 15 zeros behind it. Even that doesn't mean anything to any of us. But if I tell you that that number had doubled in the last 2 years, it will tell you how fast the digitization of society is happening and how much at risk we are of lagging behind as a cultural sector. I think that's one of my big concerns. So I firmly believe, like Robert, I think, mentioned, big data is observational. It doesn't mean anything per se. We'll need other forms of interpretation of that data in the form of surveys. But I think more and more plain old surveys might be replaced by deeper forms of more intuitive forms of digging into impact. You know, what did did experience do with people, and how much is that in line with what we were hoping that this would translate to? And that brings me to that expectation again from UNESCO. It says, in doing so, it might be expected that you would have or gain greater tolerance for differences and more respect and trust in others, that you would acquire the capacity to engage more actively in democratic life. So I think there's a very clear ambition in cultural participation, and that is really the thing that your big data will not capture by itself. You'll need to figure out ways to tease that out of people. And I think impact studies have gone through a tremendous evolution in the past, let's say 10 years. And I think that's really the thing to focus on. So yeah, that's the answer, hopefully, to your question, Kathy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Harry. Quite a wide answer as well. Thank you. Maybe I can now turn back to Robert, because, well, we know that you have been working with Rome, with Mr. Luca Bergamo, the Deputy Mayor for Culture of the City of Rome, to help measure cultural participation, combining survey data and Vodafone data. And maybe you can indeed tell us a bit more about the approach, so how you did it, so that other places can learn, and the findings. That's very interesting indeed. Robert, please.
Thank you. So just as you mentioned, the work started with Luca Bergamo, who, before he became the deputy mayor, he was advocating cultural policy on participation and so forth. And part of that, we had been working together at Culture Action Europe, is how to make comparable data accessible for non-statisticians who want to implement cultural policies and measure the impact for them locally. So let me just very quickly, just let me share one slide. This is really using comparable data for European level. Measuring non-participation. So what you see here, in the past, had been not had been in the concert in the past 12 months. It was in Italy 74%, in Poland 78%, in Denmark it's only 40%. So this is really a kind of a Eurobarometer-based data, which is repeated every 5 years, and you can make it usable. But as it had been said before, in order to use it as a city level, it's very, very limited. So you have to go down to the regions as both, and see whether the central region in Rome can be compared to other central regions somewhere else. We have similar stuff, for example, the urban audit, which are people who are working on local level with trying to understand where they are in comparison to other cities. They also have comparable data. Of course, this is very different in Italy, because as Annalisa was saying, they had this huge tradition of measuring quality of life and cultural participation. So you have much more. But if you are a policymaker who wants to benchmark your particular place in a European context, you really would like to do some kind of comparisons there. So what we have designed here was, especially after looking at the urban comparison data, is it really even the aggregate data for regions or cities is good enough for targeted cultural policy interventions, or do we have to go beyond that? So we were looking at the data for Italy, which can be discussed at a much more fine detail because it's a huge sample size, and you see wide differences within urban regions as well, or even cities like that. So for that, we said, okay, what if we are selecting different profiles, two different type of profiles within Rome, and this is what we have done. I have selected two. Let me see if you can. I'm sorry if you can see. It's Lucrezia Romana, Torre Angela, the blue ones and the green ones. One very, very different profiles, not very far from each other. So this is what I would call it's really Rome is not one city, and probably other metropolitan cities are similar. It's a collection of urban villages. If we want to have specific urban interventions, we cannot have an overall policy, cultural policy only, but we need data which are driving local interest, and before that, understanding what is there. So I really don't want to go into much more details, but just to share a few things to get a taste of. For example, this is comparing the 4 different regions in terms of trust. The questions are, can most people in my neighborhood be trusted? Or people are in my neighborhood trust each other? The public administration of Rome can be trusted. You see, the red ones are not trusted at all. So it gives you a way of understanding the local context in which you have to do interactions. Or as I said, we had the classic participation, cultural activity participation questions, which you have seen before in cross-European comparisons, asking the question, why not in the last 12 months you read a poem or went to a classical music concert or public library and so forth. We were discussing that and breaking down for for gender differences. And men are saying that they lack interest much more than women, for example. So you sort of try to squeeze data on the local level and cross sections of standard sociological variables. Then the big question is, how do we measure cultural participation, not as institutional only, but doing also the evaluations. For example, here, the use of public libraries. Differently they are evaluating the availability of cultural opportunities. So these are data which are much closer to be able to translate it to direct policy interventions. And then we selected the same neighborhoods from the big data. Now, how do you do that? You can have data on individual observations where people are spending on the last 5 days or last 7 days between 10 and 10 in the evening and 5 in the morning. Maybe that's not their residence, but more likely they can be identified with that neighborhood. So then you can track these people who are coming from that particular neighborhood, for which we have received a survey sample validated data. By the way, we had done a survey on these four in this 4 districts, which had been altogether about 2,000 face-to-face surveys, and then linking them with various events. For example, here we selected 4 big events which had been organized by the city of Rome, Festa di Roma, and we estimated, based on the big data, there were some 420,000 participants. We have the Lungotevere Festa, the year end for almost 300,000. Then we had specific one, the Makers Fair, in 400,000, and the Più Liberi, that's also about 100,000 participants. So you can see then here of, I lost it, but it's hard to do it interactively on the screen. But basically what you are, let me stop sharing the screen, that you have an idea of trying to do that kind of origin, like Victoria was also mentioning, that you can see where for certain cultural events the composition is and how much they are mixing. And this is the one more idea which I would like to stress, that being able to operationalize a concept which we call the third space, which is outside, not home and not in the workplace. So these are the places where you are able to spend, where you have the opportunity to socialize and build social connections, not necessarily in a cultural institution, but being able to have a lively community life, you have to have third spaces, and being able to measure that and continue to measure on an ongoing basis is a big way of how to create a more lively community, if that's the goal of your cultural policy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Robert. And then there is a lot of demand for further information on what you have done with Rome, so maybe we can share it in our post-event communication as well, both technical and maybe on the conclusions. So maybe we can spend another 5 minutes to sum up this round on big data, etc. And I want to also hear from the 3 speakers again. What would be your 3 tips? What are your 3 recommendations for regional and city governments on how they can improve the measurement and the understanding of cultural participation trends? Maybe Victoria, can you kick off with this one?
Sorry, yeah, I'm ready. So, well, probably the first one, I will say 3 times: collaborate, collaborate, and collaborate, right? Collaborate in 3 stages. The first one, to identify the relevant questions about participation. And probably there is no need of big data to do this. We start with what you have. Of course, being it evidence-based, we need to, all of us, we need to consider accurate and timely descriptions of the reality. Not neglecting small and proximity infrastructure and small and proximity cultural assets. Music schools, libraries, this was debated last week in the European Urban Agenda. I think it's very important, but also small heritage and intangible heritage, which are part of Baukultur here, and it's going to be mainstreamed, and it should be. So this is a political question, and this is very context dependent, and the evaluation of how important one question is over the others is a political, and probably this deserves collaborations, because this should be undertaken as a deliberative process, and the participatory governance of cultural heritage and of cultural participation is there. Then once that the questions are set, of course, cooperate, second time, to set if big data analysis can help and establish partnerships with the owners and the providers of big data, which are not citizens at all, but all already private companies. And the third one is to cooperate in the analysis. This is far from being a silo. There won't be only economists, there won't be only physicists. There is no such thing as computational social science that can be ascribed to one discipline and not to the others. So partnerships are needed. And this means that partnerships must be stable, and stable based on trust and highly interdisciplinary and intensive. One research project, this is being established as once, probably is not far enough. Then collaborate 3 times and in every dimension in a stable basis, and then experiment. This is difficult for public institutions to be asked to experiment, to politicians to take risk, but social innovation should also be there. They should allow for research, they should allow to test and experiment, and use the best of user-generated data actually to put that into practice. Experimental designs that can be risky, but which could be tracked near in real time, are always worth trying, right? So now you don't have to wait for 1 year, 4 years till you can see something, some hint of what was the effect of such an intervention in your national survey for cultural practices and habits. You can nearly track this in real time, and you can redesign, and you can implement, you can experiment. And the third one is taking responsibility. There will always be a need of statistics and official registers. This is important because this is also challenged by digitization. Complex data sets, well, it's logic that participation will depend on supply-driven conditions. So as a researcher, I have the feeling that we need a lot more information about the supply. We don't have clear depiction of how cultural heritage, what is the stock of cultural heritage, which are the infrastructures from which services from the citizens can be derived, and how citizens will access to those services. So this is one of the tasks that the state, meaning public administration, cannot just say we are not taking responsibility over it. Notably, if we understand today these divides, the rural-urban divide, this is data-driven because it was the most accurate measurement that could be obtained from big survey. Now we can do better. But there are some infrastructure that should be at least promoted and probably paid also by public authorities. I'm thinking about the protection and the inventories regarding, for instance, intangible cultural heritage in terms of digital maps, atlas, and collaborative processes in order to map cultural resources. And this mapping of cultural resources involved also a lot of digital files, metadata. So the complexity that Harry was talking about, probably we can ask the public administration to create infrastructure for this, right? Or at least the kickoff and the payment for that. Otherwise, if we just trust philanthropy and corporate to do something on this, we are going to have another session. So this could be a question for the next session. Are they willing to pay for the new libraries, digital libraries, in which the cultural heritage can be there? research, and also because there are several very nice initiatives in Spain. For instance, the Atlas of Intangible Cultural Heritage in Andalusia, but there are also sound maps to preserve rural heritage in terms of traditional sounds of the landscape. So this is infrastructure, right? So this is not about building new museums, but building that infrastructure. And then another limitation is that cultural participation is a highly social concept. So for the time being, many of these user-generated data are individual registers of access and participation of data. So we still need household surveys because as Annalisa said before, cultural participation measured at the family level is very relevant, and we don't know many of the things that these informal processes of cultural transmission, how they are developed. Household expenditure, because the equipment, typically cultural equipment, home equipment that during COVID was so important, right? Infrastructure that you had in order to get access to digital contents, to reproduce them with good quality of sound, video, whatever. This is both at the household levels and contents, because for the time being, we know that there are big inequalities in the access of to these digital contents. And these depend a lot on education, but also on income, right? So there are lots of people that are consuming, probably for entertainment, digital contents, digital cultural contents. And well, not all of us have been enjoying the opportunity to visiting twice Wilmore Hall in London for chamber music during the lockdown, right? And it was not lack of accessibility at all. It was lack of interest, because this is not in the menu of many people, right? So we still need that one. And then for the time being, there are big inequalities in the access to financial products, for instance. So household expenditure surveys are important because the analysis of data derived from transactions and credit card measures, probably they are not covering the whole population. And this also applies to not, even if the penetration rates in Western countries are quite relevant, and we can think about universal access to broadband and to digital services, this is not quite the case. And we still need, this was in the take responsibility, go on doing what you are doing, because we need specific surveys to groups of the population that are under research because of their health, disabilities, nationality, ethnicity, religion, linguistic groups. So as I said before, each regional or local institution has to take into account its context, but this is important. And the last one is that public authorities should level the field and should also be the guardians of our privacy and intimacy, right? Because we are not, as individuals, we are not the sources of data. We are not only taxpayers, but we are citizens. And we want to be one of the main reason for this research is to gain richer and deeper insights about how to construct better societies. So data protection, data privacy is an issue.
Yes, thank you so much, Victoria. That's a very rich set of items on the menu of things that local and regional governments can be doing. And I also remember from our previous discussions that you really stressed that we need to better understand how inequality works and to track inequality also in the sense of geography. So, and that can really maybe help channel the new cultural infrastructure, new cultural offer there where it is most needed or where it is most absent somehow. But yeah, thank you so much. Maybe if I can turn again back to Robert and Harry, but if I may ask you to really be very brief with your couple of points on recommendations for city and regional governments, what can they do to improve the understanding of cultural participation and the measurement of it. Thank you. Maybe Robert, you start.
Okay, just very briefly, make sure that this is not a research project, what we do. So that would alienate a lot of people if it's positioned as only as a kind of cultural research. Involve people even in the producing the data. You are able to create, always find exciting people who are exciting about this, and local civic organizations, others who would like to set goals for their own activities and use this one as a goal setting exercise. What you can do is probably that's more in a more level of association of cities or others who come together to press big data owners to share. Just think about what Google was doing during the pandemic. He was able to give data away free of charge on how people are moving during the pandemic. If it can be used for public goods, then we can use the same data for other public goods as well when we are setting into the context of well-being and quality of life where culture belongs. So again, what I would like to emphasize, move outside of the research framework, try to critically review what you have done in the past. There are all kinds of administrative silos by different city organizations are not sharing their data, but if they would be able to share it and synthesize it, then it would be much easier to create observational data and combination with primary data gathering as well.
Thank you. And Harry, maybe just a very brief thought from your side.
Yeah, that's the main difficulty, huh? As a moderator, keeping it short. So I think it all starts with intent. You know, if I'd have to advise a city, it starts with what do you want to measure, and then you figure out how to do that. I'm going to give you one example. I'll put the link on the chat. In Hamburg, they did an incredible project around what they called Smart Square. There was one of the squares that was historically extremely relevant, but that sort of over the years was sort of bypassed in an area of the city that was deteriorated and so forth. So they designed a strategy, and it was a collaborative one. I completely agree with Victoria. That's what you need, because otherwise it doesn't happen. Collaborative between your municipality, between the shop owners, between the people who live in the houses around the city. And that's, I think, how you construct meaningful and interesting ways of participating in your culture. But it was very specific. It was meant to increase a sense of pride for that area in the city, and also to increase the economic stability of that area for shop owners and so forth. So I think that's the one thing I want to say. The second thing is, when we talk about big data, I think we need to be extremely careful that we're not misleading ourselves. And also, we're touching upon some very serious privacy issues. I haven't heard the word GDPR mentioned since I've been part of this, but I think you cannot talk about big data, cultural participation, and not talk about privacy as well. So those are the things that I would share with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to Victoria, Harry, and Robert. That was a fantastic discussion. And now let's move to our last session in this block. And we wanted to hear from the foundations, and we designed this discussion together with the European Foundation Center, the thematic network on arts and culture. And well, the idea is that, of course, we all know that the foundations historically and the philanthropy organizations have been funding arts and culture. And then also more recently, over the past decades, maybe they were working hand in hand with the local governments, regional governments to around culture-led urban regeneration projects. No, so they are funders, but they are also those who do design projects and implement themselves large-scale projects. And obviously, over the past few months, foundations and philanthropy organizations were really at the forefront to support artists, arts and culture throughout these difficult times, during these crisis times. So with all this, we are very interested how you with your different roles are measuring the impact of your work, basically. And of course, many of the foundations, they have a lot of projects on tackling cultural participation and inclusion and education, etc. So from your perspective, it will be very interesting to understand how you measure all these things, and I guess in a quite a pragmatic and practical way. So, and of course, I mean, our idea is that we would like with the session to understand a bit better how to measure cultural participation to better inform policies and programs. So maybe I turn to Matteo and ask him, so how do you do that, and what kind of data also will be useful for your future projects?
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for your invitation. This is, as Katerina said, is a very crucial moment for Foundation, because we are facing this moment so difficult for cultural sectors. Foundation can play a crucial role in this moment, because many of them have always been interested in culture, and now can be the interpreters of some kind of need of change. In my perspective, what is a keyword in this moment, not only for the data matter, but also in general in this kind of policies and the cultural sectors, a keyword is alignment and cooperation, because the problem is that we always have to try to address our work in a more cooperative way, and not to try to work on our own, but try to play our role in the different systems, the local system, the national system, and the European system. For example, in my foundation, Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo, we are using the SDG model on the Agenda 2030 as a guide that we used recently to reorganize and reorient all our philanthropic action, and we find 3 goals and 14 missions. And this has a reflection on how to look and measure also the cultural sector, because our department, our action is not divided into thematical department, let's say museum or performing arts or heritage or libraries, but is divided following the coherence with different SDGs. So we have a line on culture for local development, a line of encouraged citizen engagement and cultural participation. We have a line on skills for cultural education for culture. I say this because this is strictly connected to the data matter, because we are working on defining for each of this mission some indicators, some KPI that can help us to underline our contribution to the SDGs of the Agenda 2030. So the idea is to use data to reorient our policy, but also to show how can we contribute to this process. This is about Compagnia di San Paolo, but I'm also representing the European Foundation Center Arts and Cultural Thematic Network, that is a place where we can share practices and reflect on how foundation can play a stronger role in this moment. A couple of years ago, we provided a survey on foundation. It's available on the website on EFC, a double survey. From one side, a survey on how foundations are working for cultural participation. We map a lot of different strategies. Audience development is currently an important area of activity, and in this role, foundation can take a risk in area that maybe sometimes are less supported by other actors. And we found in this survey that is foundation are even more inclined to build partnership and support collaboration. And another point that I want to underline is that foundation can have sometimes the freedom to work on a on a longer term policies. That is something that from the cultural sector is always underlined as an important need. I want to use this this occasion also to say that talking about cultural participation, there are a lot of practices and a lot of projects merging from the NGO sector that are very interesting to study and focus on. We provide for this a platform on the web that it's called partisan.eu, a participating citizen. That is a platform dedicated to cultural participation and citizen engagement, and is open to managers, to policymakers, to NGOs, also to share data on cultural participation surveys in order to collect this this experience that are sometimes very little but very interesting as a model we can scale up to maybe the public sector to try to influence the building of this kind of intervention. Another thing I want to underline, as was just said before, an important level is the European cooperation. I think we have to, in Italy, for example, in my foundation, we have to have a stronger role in European cooperation. We have a project on this on Creative Europe that is Adeste Plus, but I think Luisella will talk about this in a moment. That is a large-scale European cooperation project that want to work exactly on skills of cultural institution on cultural participation.
Yes, thank you so much, Matteo. Luisella, so what's your take on this? And maybe after you respond, we can go back to both of you for a very rapid feedback and ideas on, again, what, from your point of view, citizen regions can do to improve the measurement of cultural participation. And as we are a bit pressed for time, let's try to stick to the schedule. Luisella, please.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thanks for inviting me here. And my point of view is a little bit different because Fondazione Fitzcarraldo is a private operative foundation, which is devoted to research, consultancy, and documentation on the cultural sector at all. We are focusing on the topic of participation in a wider and large sense. So we embrace the point of view related to the cultural democracy approach. So trying to have a huger definition of what cultural activities are. So taking into account even those forms of active cultural participation, which are now emerging and are becoming much more relevant. I think that if we just focus on the traditional cultural activities in this specific moment, we are running the risk to not to have a wider and complete overview of the diverse form of cultural activities and the diverse form and intensity in which the cultural participation can be declined. And so and our observatory is focusing even on this huger and diverse form. And I think it is particularly important right now in this moment when COVID forced all of us in taking into account and having a different or surrogated form of participation in cultural activities, sometimes mediated through digital or sometimes in a new hybrid form of cultural participation in which mixed form are merging together and in which even a new active role to the so-called till now consumer or participants is involved, trying to giving even a new idea of the term prosumer, which is born from the crisis from producer and consumer is having right now, and it is having not only in the digital sphere, but in the realm or the real life. And another element we have to take into consideration is that often statistics are focusing just on participation in the final cultural activities, but cultural activities are processes which can be developed and can have different touch point of moment to keep in contact with the audiences, which are not just the final performances or the exhibition, but there are different stages. And the last element I would like to tackle is the fact that that participation is not something uniform, but is related not only to the number of people who are taking part in the cultural activities, but in terms of depth and scope of people's engagement, so the different intensity of the relation with the cultural activities, and in with the topic of diversifying audiences, so tackling the topic related to equality and the culture as a right for all the peoples. These three different levels in terms of intensity of participation are related even to the ambition that cultural organization in general can have in relation with their audiences. So in terms of widening participation, which is one goal, of course, but not the only one. Together with that, there is the ambition of deepening the relationship and making relationship in a different way. So making a kind of shift in the paradigm and not focusing just on enlarging the number of participants, but in defining in a better or in a different way, not better, sorry, not judgment in this, in a different way, the relationship with our audiences, and taking into account that audiences are not one kind of person, but they are taking values, they are taking into account different ambition, different needs of time, of interest, of desire to find in the cultural participation and in the cultural activities. If we start in considering and taking into account even the ambition and so the benefit we want to generate for the audiences we want to involve, we can have even a different spectrum of the level of participation and of the benefits that people require in taking and being involved in cultural activities. I agree completely when we said that sometimes the lack or the missing participation in cultural activities is related to the lack of interest, but the lack of interest sometimes in the form of traditional cultural activities, but there are different ways or different act or bridge to establish new kind of dialogue with people. When we start to consider audiences not just like consumers, but like people, like person. And this person are requiring or are looking for different kind of benefits from their participation in cultural activities. Benefits in terms of individual well-being, but also relational, civic and civil well-being in terms of being accepted, in terms of being valorized, in terms of being considered part of something. And in this way, culture can be a driver or a drive even to make more aware the citizens and to involve people, attracting them from different perspectives. So not just from the offer as we conceived till now. And I think that this is a key point, even thinking about the present moment we are living now and the future. We don't know what is going to happen with COVID, but right now what we saw is that digital consumption or participation in digital activity is increased, but with different level of engagement. Sometimes the access to the digital offer is huge, amplified the possibility to get in touch with different audiences, but sometimes this relation is just a moment, just minutes, but not a concrete relation. If we wanted to switch our perspective, we need to find even these elements which keep us or allow us in defining the new levels of participation and trying to find even those kind of indicators which can be relevant for us as cultural organizers, but for the audiences we want to involve too. And this is in relation, of course, with the goals and the ambition of the cultural organization, but it must fit in a user frame, which sometimes is related to policy demand or some frames in which we can build something together with other organizations, not just in the public domain, but sometimes with other foundations. What we are doing, for example, as Matteo said, with the project Adeste Plus, where we are working together to define the frame of the impact, and so trying to define different kind of indicators, which gives the taste of the quality of participation to not just participation. Sorry.
Yes, thank you so much, Luisella. And I very much like your point that, in fact, presence doesn't mean participation. So a visit to a museum or presence in a museum room doesn't mean participation. And we really need to think about this intensity of engagement. And of course, well, that's a good point, but it makes the task even more difficult how you measure this intensity, how you measure this engagement, as you were underlining. I know, Matteo, if you have really one point to share, your final point, and then we move on to the wrap-up.
Yes, just want to underline what are two things, in my opinion, that are that as a foundation, but also as a citizen region, we should work on. The first one, in my opinion, is use this crisis to work on the organizational development of cultural institution, because the crisis can be a chance of innovation in order to make them more audience oriented in a way, but also in the capacity of collecting and managing data, because cultural institution themselves, they are managing data. This is something rich that we can work on. The second one, I know is more difficult maybe, but I think if you want to work on cultural participation, we also have to work in the link between the cultural sector, the welfare sector, and the education sector. It's not a matter that can only be shared by the one who are working in the cultural sector. It's something wider, and this is I think something very important.
Well, thank you so much, Matteo and Luisella. So now I turn to Nadim. I'm very curious to hear what are your takeaways from this very intense discussion and your own conversation with Pierluigi Sacco and Fabrice Murtin on related issues. So Nadim, please.
Well, thank you, Katya, and thank you to everybody as well. And it's been a fascinating conversation. I've scribbled down pages and pages and pages of notes here during the conversations. And given the short time that I have, I'm not going to be able to do justice to the depth of the conversation that you've had. But there are perhaps some key takeaways that have struck me, I think, as being very important in this conversation, but also I think very important in the way that I think we can move forward. I mean, perhaps one of the first takeaways is that a large part of the data that we currently have is perhaps focusing not in its entirety on all the right issues. I mean, we tend to have a relatively good view of inputs and outputs, but we have perhaps a much weaker view of outcomes. And I think this was the point that Luisella made very, very strongly and passionately, I thought, in her intervention. You know, we need to have perhaps a much broader framework that allows us to have a much better understanding of all of the factors that drive outcomes. You know, and what's missing, of course, is that discussion about outcomes. And within that framework, I mean, we need to have an understanding of determinants. You know, so this brings us back to Matteo's final point about the importance of including all stakeholders in the conversation. We want to understand these determinants that allow us to participate. And within those determinants, of course, we also have barriers. You know, there was a very strong few presentations that focus, for example, on the fact that we have barriers in the system. And sometimes it seems to be that the barrier, of course, is that people are just not interested. But what I would like to better understand is to what extent that lack of interest is a function of something else. It's a function of a lack of time. It's a function of a lack of income. And, you know, we need to have a framework that allows us to understand all of those dynamics, because, of course, if we had a better understanding of the outcome, you know, in terms of the value that it has on inclusiveness, the value that it has on well-being, not necessarily in some normative way or some monetized way, but certainly in a way that is tangible, it may allow us to better understand how we can make policy work better, and recognizing, for example, that there may be some type of trade-off between, for example, lower income, for perhaps want of a better word, but also better outcomes, better sense of well-being. And these choices are sort of invisible in the conversation that we're having at the moment, and that it needs to be recognized, I think, in terms of how we drive the work forward. Now, perhaps just a historical view in all of this. I think that, you know, part of what we've discussed today is really driven around, for example, the availability of current data sets today. And we've seen some very good innovative examples of big data that can be used to provide insights in ways that were unimaginable, I guess, not so long ago. And those insights are becoming very powerful. And with those insights, I think we're also building on momentum that we need to do more. And COVID, for example, has exacerbated that need to do more. There's a much stronger realization today that the absence of information on the culture and creative sector is also giving us an inability to really navigate the discussion around well-being. We recognize that there are powerful drivers that, you know, if we have this data, we can have a much more healthy conversation around how we can achieve all of that. And I guess I wanted to make a few points just in terms of some of the initiatives that are already going on that could help, for example, I think push this in the right direction. Because, of course, there are a number of different things that are going on that have been driven, of course, by this greater focus on well-being, this greater focus on inclusiveness, and this greater focus, of course, on the fact that we understand from the anecdotal data sets that we have that we observe these geographical space-based disparities across a number of different domains. And at the OECD, for example, tomorrow we have a discussion on smart cities and inclusive growth. And within that, of course, you know, we have an opportunity to embed this notion of basically digital, if you would, culture or mechanisms of culture, very, very much in that conversation. So again, we have a hook in which we can start to think about how we can bring some of the stakeholders and some of those that have data to the table. We also have within the OECD a smart data strategy, and that smart data strategy is basically pushing us to recognize that there are a whole range of new data sources out there that need to be mainstreamed in statistical information systems. And all of those big data sources are pushing us in very much the same direction. We're having this convergence in terms of how we bring that data to the table. The OECD and other international organizations also recognize they have an important role to play that allows an awful lot of this big data from these digital platforms to come to the table. So we're looking to have these types of collaborations with them that allow us basically to provide this information to national authorities and, of course, to you as important stakeholders that will allow us to have this better understanding of some of these issues, around, for example, mobility. The mobility is a very important tool, I think, that allows us to have a much better understanding of the place-based notion of access to culture, but also the place-based notion around disparities in access. And I think that's really crucial in terms of how we move forward. There is, of course, a broad area of work that's fundamental, I think, to what's going on here, that recognizes that when we talk about beyond GDP, it's all about these non-market aspects. It's all about these prosumers. These things are not actually measured in any of these frameworks. And there's a big drive at the moment to make sure that within updates to our standard accounting manuals, we embody within these manuals these notions of the non-market aspect, these prosumers, the value, for example, that we gain as a society from our own activities. They're not necessarily picked up through monetary exchanges. And I think that the cultural and creative aspects of all of this needs to be front and center of a large part of that debate. And it's been too ignored, I think, in that discussion. And I think we can do an awful lot more to make sure that it is firmly embodied in all of that. There was a long discussion, there were quite a few, for example, examples about time use surveys as being really important instruments that we can capitalize on. I wanted to say that, because of these other initiatives that are going on to push the inclusive growth agenda and make it much more part of the official statistical information system, there is a lot of momentum there to try to improve the frequency, to improve basically the number of countries that are doing it, and also to increase the scope. And I think there's plenty of scope here to embody within time use surveys these notions of culture and creativity. But in particular, for example, we can also embody perhaps in there things, additional questions that we never thought of. Questions, for example, about why do you have this type of allocation of time? Would you like, for example, to have more time to spend on culture and creativity? And I think that the final point, I guess, because I could go on and on and on, because like I said, I have pages and pages of notes to take. I think the final point is that we also need to recognize that when we talk about cultural participation, and many of you have made these points, we need to understand that there is a differentiated notion of cultural participation. It's not just, for example, one notion. We need to have that granularity in recognizing there are different aspects of cultural participation that will allow us to better understand that, some people, for example, depending on their backgrounds, depending on where they live, participate in different ways. And that granularity, I think, is core to us improving the information set, but also making sure that we have better policies to push the culture and creative agenda. That's what I wanted to say. Like I said, it can go on for a while, but thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'd like to think that we can follow up in some type of meaningful way around an expanded framework that recognizes determinants and also pushes this notion of granularity and, of course, differentiation in what participation actually means.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Thank you so much, Nadim. Yeah, indeed. So what are the factors that drive outcomes, and what are the determinants that allow us to participate? But what I liked most is what you said. We can do an awful lot more as OECD on this. So let's really try to do a bit more on this area of work. So maybe with this, I would like really to thank so much all our speakers that joined for this marathon 2 hours long session, and also very thankful to our audience, and there was quite a lot of questions, and I encourage our speakers to respond to these quite concrete questions that our participants are asking. So with this, thank you so much, and we stop now for a short lunch break, and we will restart again at 2:30 Paris and Brussels time. So enjoy your lunch and see you at 2:30 sharp. Thank you so much.